Hello. In this presentation, I hope to explain a little bit about the Dublin Core metadata scheme, a topic relevant not only to libraries, but to all kinds of information and technology areas. For some background, following the Second International World Wide Web Conference in 1994, various information specialists became concerned with how networked information resources could be described so that they could be easily discovered. As a result, they organized a workshop in March of 1995 in Dublin, Ohio, the home of OCLC headquarters. There, a group of library and information science, information technology, and archives and museum specialists, among others, first articulated the concept of Dublin Core. In creating Dublin Core, their goal was to create a set of fundamental metadata elements that was simple to use, interoperable between different semantic communities, detailed enough to be useful, extensible, and flexible. This was the beginning of the Dublin Core Metadata Initiative, or DCMI, which develops and maintains Dublin Core specifications to this day. Dublin Core is a set of conventions for describing digital information resources. At its most basic, Dublin Core refers to 15 elements which can describe an information resource. They are typically articulated in terms of a property, a category of descriptive information, and a corresponding value, the information that applies to the particular resource in question. The elements are title, the name of the resource; creator, the entity primarily responsible for making the resource; subject, the topic of the resource. As with some other elements, the DCMI recommends that people use a controlled vocabulary when naming a value here. Description, an account of the content; publisher, an entity responsible for making the resource available; contributor, an entity responsible for making some contribution to the resource not covered by the other elements; date, a date associated with an event relevant to the resource, such as its creation, digitization, or modification. This may also be a time span. Type, the nature or genre of the content of the resource. Format, the kind of physical or digital manifestation of the resource. This could refer to the file format, medium, or dimensions. Identifier, a specific reference to the resource in a given context, such as a URI. Language, the language in which the resource is presented. Relation, a reference to a different but related resource. Coverage, the extent or scope of the content. This can be spatial or temporal, or refer to the jurisdiction under which the resource is relevant. Rights, information about rights held in or over the resource, such as copyright. And source, a related resource from which the resource being described is derived. Each element is optional and can be repeated, and elements can be displayed in any order. The word core implies a possibility for expansion, and the scheme was not intended to be limited to the first 15 elements or the way they were first expressed. Qualified Dublin Core officially includes 3 more elements: audience, provenance, and rights holder, as well as a group of element refinements, also called qualifiers. Generally, qualifiers either identify an encoding scheme used in representing an element or refine the meaning of an element. Qualifying the encoding scheme essentially means identifying which controlled vocabulary values are taken from. For example, for the element date, there are two approved encoding scheme qualifiers, DCMI period and W3CDTF. Element refinement qualifiers are subcategories added onto an element which make it more specific. In the case of the element date, there are 5: created, valid, available, issued, and modified. These refinement qualifiers follow the dumbed-down principle. If an application is unable to recognize a refinement term, it can simply ignore it and treat the metadata value as if the qualifier were not present. However, refinement qualifiers cannot extend or change the meaning of an element. People will sometimes need a more specific scheme for a particular application. In these cases, they can use or design application profiles. An application profile is a scheme designed for a specific application, which specifies what a community is trying to achieve with a particular application, the types of things that will be described and the relationships between them, the metadata terms to be used and the rules for their use, and the syntax that will be used to encode the data. An application profile draws on one or more existing schemes. The DCMI has provided a framework, pictured here, for designing application profiles. The DCMI has also provided an abstract model for how metadata can be structured, and has presented it visually in the form of flowcharts. It generally shows how different pieces of information relate to each other. It is independent of any particular encoding syntax, but it is used as the model for Dublin Core. Defining this model allows for Dublin Core to be extended and allows for crosswalks with other metadata schemes. Crosswalks facilitate interoperability by translating elements and values between schemes. The DCMI resource model shows how information resources are described. The DCMI description set model shows how a record is comprised of descriptions that are encoded in vocabularies. The DCMI vocabulary model shows how terms in a vocabulary are encoded. The Dublin Core scheme is format independent. It can be represented in different ways. However, there are some widely accepted syntactic representations. Dublin Core has sometimes been expressed in HTML, Hypertext Markup Language, which was the first encoding specification to officially be recommended. Representing Dublin Core metadata in HTML is fairly simple and useful in contexts where search engines are configured to take advantage of meta tags. However, it is not as good for more complex constructions or situations where metadata records are needed rather than metadata embedded in documents. Dublin Core is also frequently represented in RDF, or Resource Description Framework, which is a framework for describing resources on the web that is written in XML, Extensible Markup Language. RDF has its own strengths and weaknesses. For example, a single RDF encoding can represent multiple resources as long as each is kept within a separate RDF description element, but qualifiers and locally defined elements cannot be used, and the resulting RDF XML cannot be embedded in web pages. Some problems have arisen around the element list. Dublin core is generic, which is both a strength and a weakness. At this point, not many communities have extensions. There's also the potential for overlap between elements, such as author, contributor, and publisher, and differences between versions of a record. For example, in the case of a digitized JPEG of a photograph, should the person who scanned the photo be credited as creator alongside the photographer, or perhaps credited instead of them? Such issues are the concern of the Dublin Core Metadata Initiative, which maintains the standard. The DCMI is an organization that supports the development of interoperable metadata standards. It is international in scope, focused on working across disciplines, open to all interested parties, and neutral regarding the purposes, business models, and technologies which might use its standards and specifications. Its activities include working groups, conferences, workshops, education, and the promotion of metadata standards and practices. Going forward, it seems likely that they will continue to be relevant as metadata standards continue to evolve and be applied further. Thank you for viewing my presentation.